Hello, friends. Today I am joined by a repeat guest and a favorite who has been requested by many people as a repeat guest. Rachel was homeschooled from pre-K through 12th grade, but apparently that wasn't enough. Today, she is a second generation homeschooler who also runs a YouTube channel, Seven in All, where she talks about practical recommendations and resources for building a joy-filled homeschool. She's also a homeschool curriculum writer who, after writing content for larger curriculum companies, has launched her own site where she sells affordable homeschool resources in both English and Spanish. And actually, I think that was one of the things we talked about last time. We talked about raising bilingual children and bilingual homeschooling. But today we're going to focus on a few other topics. But here at the beginning, tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, and your background with homeschooling.
Well, yes, like you just heard, I was homeschooled myself my whole life. So the first time I was ever in a traditional school was actually walking into college on my first day. And, it's completely novel experiencing the classroom and teachers and all of that. And then I graduated from college with a bachelor's of arts degree and got married very young. And I now have three young sons, two of whom are school age, and one who is a wild toddler, just to add the chaos that you need in the homeschool day. So very full days with them right now, but loving it.
Surprise! Quickly interrupting the conversation to let you know that Rachel's channel has a new name since she and I chatted earlier this summer. You can now find Rachel at the Nerdy Homeschooler on YouTube and Instagram. So anytime you hear us talk about Seven in All during this episode, just remember the new name is actually the Nerdy Homeschooler. I've updated all the links in the show notes as well, but I actually wanted to give Rachel a chance to introduce herself to you afresh. So stick around for like the next 1.5 minutes for Rachel's channel intro. Then it's straight back to the Homeschool Conversations episode. This is a great one, and I can't wait for you to hear Rachel's encouragement.
Welcome to the Nerdy Homeschooler. I'm Rachel. I'm a second-generation homeschool mom to three. Now, I know that some homeschool families try to shy away from the nerdy stereotype and the images of thick glasses and even thicker books that it conjures up, but not me. You see, I think that the freedom to nerd out or get nerdy over whatever makes our hearts sing is one of the greatest gifts of homeschool. On this channel, you will find all sorts of nerdy homeschool videos, from analyzing curriculums to geeking out over great new books, and discussing the details of real-life, day-to-day homeschool. My goal is to encourage my fellow homeschool parents to find delight in experiencing education together with their families, and in challenging both themselves and their children on this journey further up and further in. I also create PDF curriculum resources that I sell on my website, where'dyoulearnthat.com, with each resource being something that I saw a need for in the homeschool community. So, no, I'm not one of those cool homeschoolers. I'm one of the nerdy ones, and I'm totally comfortable with that. If you'd like, join me over here by clicking that subscribe button, because I will always be back with more nerdy homeschool videos. I'll see you later. Bye.
I sometimes will think back on those days as I now, all my kids are old. I have 10 to 20 are my five now. And I have so many fond memories of the little years. It's such a rich, special time, but also it can be very exhausting.
Yes, yeah, both can be true.
Yes. Well, what are some of the challenges that you have faced homeschooling? And maybe that's yourself as the homeschool mom or memories as a teacher or as a student, rather. And how have you sought to overcome those challenges?
Uh, I really always very firmly feel that the most challenging part of homeschool is the human element, the human frailty, our own weakness and our sinfulness. So homeschool is not programming robots. And if it were, that would be easy. The straightforward education part tends to be a lot easier than wrestling with our own humanity and that of our children. So whether that's human frailty, in the sense of physical sickness, or in the heart sickness that is our battle with sin, that is the serious challenge that does tend to be more exhausting and draining than, just teaching the alphabet and math and talking about good literature. So how we meet this challenge, that is really our hope as Christians, and it's the challenge of all of life, knowing that by God's grace, we get to meet this challenge with the knowledge that Jesus paid it all, that his blood is enough, that his grace is sufficient for us, that his power is made perfect in weakness. So, homeschool is just kind of a microcosm of the whole rest of life, and leaning into the gospel is how we meet, these deep challenges with wrestling with our own humanity and that of our children.
Yeah, I am more and more convinced that it is the gospel alone that brings hope and peace and joy and rest, all of those things that just as humans, let alone as homeschool moms, we desire. And I totally relate as well to what you're saying. It's not necessarily the academic part that's the challenging part of homeschooling. It's that like I'm in a house filled with other sinners, and lo and behold, I bring my own sin to the table or the living room couch every time. But yet that's also because it's that hard thing of our weaknesses rubbing up against each other. It's also a place where you see God sanctifying and growing and bringing really amazing opportunities to repent and to grow as well. Yeah.
Yes. And we often talk, the constancy of homeschool, being together so much, is one of the great gifts in many ways. And it also is one of the reasons that it can be more challenging to have those personalities rubbing up against each other all the time.
Yes.
And all that. But it does give so many opportunities to learn how to love other people well, for ourselves and for our kids, and what that looks like in day to day.
Well, Rachel, one of the reasons why it's always fun to chat with you and to follow your work online is because I love that kind of second generation perspective that you have, that I can have as well sometimes. And sometimes we can maybe see some stereotypes or some blind spots in the homeschool community, just because we've kind of been around and seen a lot of different things. And I wanted to ask you about something I notice a lot, and that is this sort of dichotomy that's put out. You're either this super organized, stressed perfectionist who's like ruled by the curriculum and grids and has destroyed the love of learning in their children, or you're the hot mess mom who never met like a goal list she liked and just sort of lets her kids do whatever they want. And, those are obviously extreme examples, but do you see this as maybe a false dichotomy, maybe even a place where we can be putting our pride in one or the other identity? And then what would be, from your perspective, a way that we can pursue a consistent, capable, calm homeschooling approach instead?
But I think those who have watched some of my videos and read my posts do know that this is a topic that I do like to address. And that's because social media, just the nature of it, does lend itself toward the over dramatic and towards extremes, dramatic false dichotomies, because they are a lot more viral. Nuance doesn't tend to go viral. So acting like there are two options and two options only is what you see a lot, that you can either be stressed out and exhausted and your kids are stapled to a desk 8 hours a day, mindlessly completing boring worksheets, or you're frolicking in the woods, you're baking cookies, you never met a worksheet, you're just reading stories, letting the kids do whatever they want. And if the kid isn't interested in learning about something, well, hey, connection over curriculum. So those are the two visions we're getting. And I think when we get our eyes focused back on the real world, we can pretty quickly realize that these are not our only two options. They're not really the best options or the most realistic and most effective options for educating children. So speaking peaking in these extremes will help you go viral. If that's the goal, and sometimes I guess it is, having these over dramatic extremes definitely will make your reels more popular. They'll just get more views. It's just reality of how social media works. But if you get your eyes focused on the real world, you'll notice that in the real world, people don't tend to be that dramatic because the drama is not rewarded quite as much. So although it's not viral content, it's not clickbait, approaching homeschool as calm, capable, as a skilled educator with a purpose and a goal in mind is actually going to be more effective and more pleasant for everyone involved. That I don't have to choose one identity. I can just look at the kids in front of me, figure out the goals and the priorities that are specific to my family, and do the work needed along the long path and the long marathon of homeschooling to work in that direction.
And what does that look like then for how you approach that and think about that first, like big picture on your own, and then as you implement that on a, just ordinary Tuesday in your homeschool?
Yeah, so big picture, I do look at, what's priority to my family. And I always say my homeschool style is nerdy. So yes, we do the books, we do the worksheets, we do the grammar, and we enjoy it. We do the math worksheets, and I have a son who just loves math and just calculates things all the time. So, we are not shying away from academics. We enjoy that for its own sake. We do have some priorities, like mentioned before, Spanish. We make Spanish a big part of our homeschool. A lot of people aren't going to do that, but that's something that suits our family's needs and our family's goals. So we kind of look at what our family wants, and look at our family's lifestyle, which every family is going to have different situations. And then we plan for that. We adjust for that. And then in day to day, I work to make a plan that is actually something that I can accomplish. And I'm always going for, something effective. It's not going to be perfect. At some point, the 1-year-old is going to be on the table. And then he's probably going to, throw school books on the floor at some point. Like things like that are going to happen. So I'm not looking for this, perfectionist or dreamy view, but in the midst of, everyday real life challenges, you can still be having very real learning, especially when you as a homeschool parent work on developing your own teaching skills, work on studying your own students to realize, okay, I know when you know this, and I know when you don't know this. So constantly working on growing. And I think it does help to become more confident over time when you can see the progress and you can see that, hey, I don't have to worry about whether I'm doing a good job because I can see the evidence that I am, and I can see the growth throughout our days. And that helps a lot to be pursuing routines that work and lessons that are effective. So yeah, I always encourage moms to dedicate themselves to pursuing skilled, capable, effective homeschooling. And what is effective will look different depending on what kids you have, what situations you have, but it's still worth pursuing. And this idea absolutely gets misunderstood, I think. So I've written before about how and why I teach good handwriting skills in my homeschool. And if work is done sloppily, I'll have it be redone. No, we're not going to do the sloppy handwriting. And I'll get comments in response to this, like, good luck paying for therapy for those kids, toxic perfectionism. And I just completely reject that, actually. For me, I do not see building real skills and having standards worth meeting as the same thing as perfectionism. So perfectionism is an issue. I have a video on YouTube about how perfectionism can cripple a homeschool and how to combat it for those who naturally struggle with it. But it's not actually just the teaching of useful skills or the mere having of standards and enforcing those standards that creates perfectionism. But we can communicate standards. We can communicate the why behind our standards and work on effectively teaching to whatever those standards are.
I think that's so important to make that distinction between pursuing excellence and that not being
Mm-hmm.
the same thing as perfectionism, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
idolatry, or putting undue pressure that is inappropriate, a
Mm-hmm.
burden, too heavy to bear, or
Mm-hmm.
seeing your value in something that you've accomplished. And that's like idolatry, but that's not the same
Mm-hmm.
thing as just
Yeah.
seeking to do your work well as to the Lord, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when we are working with our kids day to day, we can get a pretty good sense for when they're doing their work well and when they were just definitely not trying at all. So it all comes down to knowing your kid.
Yeah. Well, another place, Rachel, I see, some of these stereotypes and maybe some of that, that drama, and we got to make our viral reels. Another
Mm-hmm.
place that happens is a lot with homeschooling in the little years, homeschooling our preschoolers, our young learners. So what advice would you give a new homeschooler who's trying to navigate all this information and figuring out what they really need to be doing? What's the best way to homeschool their young learners?
Yeah. So for every family, early years will look different. Like, so if you have your oldest child, early learning is probably going to look different with them versus with your youngest child. So just be prepared with that in mind. But I do caution all new homeschoolers to be wary of advice that seems more extreme and dramatic. I will see more times than I'd like many dramatic warnings contrasting the drudgery of miserable hours spent plugging away at preschool and kindergarten curriculum versus just simply letting your children play outdoors all day long. And I really want young parents to know that those are not your only two options. The days are long. As a stay-at-home mom to multiple young children, there are a lot of hours in the day. And you can effectively homeschool your preschooler, your kindergartner. You can teach active lessons that result in great progress, great character building, great exercise for their amazing, brilliant little minds. And they can also still play outdoors a lot. They can play indoors a lot. There's time to do both. We really get the time through the choice to homeschool. And there are lots of developmentally appropriate preschool and kindergarten curriculums out there. In fact, I can't say that I've seen the ones that require hours of boring worksheets. Maybe they're out there. I just haven't run into that many. Uh, but I've used preschool workbooks with my children that were just such a delight, cutting and pasting and using scissors. My kids just loved using scissors when they're preschoolers, like the destruction factor. It was just so much fun. And I have even created preschool and kindergarten curriculums and have had a blast using them. So I would say in the preschool years, my own big priorities and those I encourage to all new homeschool parents are: number one, build good habits. And number two, communicate big ideas. So on the habits, you want to have a rhythm of consistent learning time with mama built into your daily routines. Because building those foundational habits of cooperating with the learning process will yield fruit for years to come. If you've been having these little daily learning sessions since as long as they can remember, it's not going to come as a surprise to them when they're 6 or 7 years old and now they need to sit down and do some work with mom. So having that habit and just being able to cooperate, to be able to follow instructions, to be able to say, no, we can sit down and listen right now. It really does yield a lot of fruit. And on the second one, communicating big ideas, that's where I'm talking about big ideas about faith, about relationships, about how the world works and their role in their family and in their world. Preschoolers just naturally seem to ask so many questions, and I've seen these to be really foundational years for developing that worldview and developing their patterns of thinking. And I just love talking to preschoolers. So often you think of discussion-based learning as like something you do in high school, but really it starts very early. The conversations look different, and they might be more repeated again and again. But I love the questions they ask, and I love getting to share my worldview with my kids from the earliest years, and to do that in conversations about good books, conversations with our schoolwork. And so those are my two big priorities: is habits and big ideas.
I think that is such a helpful foundation. And then that can work out in many unique ways, right? For
Mhm.
different families and different children. But having that
Mhm.
as the foundation. And I agree also, so many purposeful conversations and discussions can be had in those years that really set the foundation for having the kind of relationship with your child and the kind of relationship with learning and exploration that's going to then impact the rest of your homeschool experience as
Mhm.
well. Yeah. Well, Rachel, are there any other blind spots or stereotypes before we move on that you want to call out?
I just see that the social media age of homeschool is very, very different from preceding decades, and I'm sure you have noticed a good bit of this as well. One issue I feel that I see, it tends to be over planning and under implementing. So I see many parents seeming to put a lot of effort into planning. They're trying to perfectly coordinate their read alouds with the historical time period or the theme unit study. They're writing down what lessons they're going to do each day in their planners months in advance. They're trying to pre-plan ahead of time exactly how many lessons they will do each week to finish a curriculum by a certain month. So they're doing all this kind of very complicated planning. But then when it comes to day-to-day implementation, I see so many reports of overwhelm, things getting dropped, suddenly realizing they haven't done a certain subject in weeks, and so on. So I feel like there seems to be, and probably fueled by social media a bit, a tendency to overcomplicate homeschool or to invest a lot of energy onto the front end planning, while I would actually suggest spending more time and energy on your day-to-day implementation, realistically. And this comes from my own experience as a second-gen homeschooler. So my mom was never out there pre-planning all the days off for the school year, because she did not know ahead of time when we would need days off. I never saw her try to schedule and predict when each one of us would finish every certain level of every one of our subjects. And I've really largely taken the same approach. Um, so my mom never planned that we would finish, fifth grade math on this day, but she did plan that we would wake up and we would do math every day. So we were very consistent, and the consistency of day-to-day implementation meant you didn't really need that specific of planning. So I do plan, I do research, I prepare, but I keep the plan more to broad strokes and I don't really overthink it. I see people stressing out about, which type of history cycle we should do and how many times are each one of my children going to get to go through the history cycle. And I just kind of feel like we don't need to stress out as much about that end. And we should maybe put more of our energy into just waking up every day and doing the work. Um, so, plan the big picture, yeah, but let's try to devote more of our energy, not so much to the perfectly coordinated plans. I do read alouds. I don't try to coordinate our read alouds with what we're doing in history. I just read books that are good books at this point, especially because a lot of historical books aren't that great for the ages of my children right now. So that's one reason. But, you can also just read good books because they're good. They don't have to be perfectly matching some theme. So that's kind of my general advice. Maybe don't stress out so much on the planning, but do wake up every day and do the work.
That is such good advice. Exactly what I try to communicate to people, that faithful consistency, that simple, ordinary thing you do, every day or most days, and you do it with joy. But just that consistency means so much more than coming up with some perfect, ideal plan that you never actually implement, right? So that's really, really important. And I think that is a good word for anyone who's listening. Well, pivoting a little bit, I know that you mentioned earlier on about how you guys, embrace the nerdy homeschoolness. And someone might say, but Rachel, like, why are you educating and teaching these things that don't matter in real life or that you're never going to use? So, what is the value of educating for things outside of their usefulness?
So yes, I must fundamentally communicate that I do not have a pragmatic view of education. I do not think that it is solely for practical or useful purposes. I always want to argue that the life of the mind is indeed part of real life. So people want to separate ideas from practical life skills. But to me, I mean, don't you want to have big ideas to mull over while you're washing the dishes? Neither one, we need both, is what I would say. We need both. The mind grows from feasting on big ideas and from wrestling with different perspectives. So for me, learning and using the brain God gave me is very much part of worship. God did not make us purely for practical purposes, but as eternal beings with the ability to think and learn and create, engage with others and with Him. And I've really seen and really believe that many of the more impractical school subjects have great benefit when it comes to exercising the hearts and the minds God gave us. And I know that you have a great love for maybe some of these impractical school subjects, for Shakespeare and the like, in your own homeschool.
Yeah, it's funny because I was actually just having this conversation with my oldest daughter recently. Because especially, I'm in the classical world, and so people like to talk about, oh, how we don't use these things because they're practical or useful. You don't get any use out of Plato or Shakespeare. And Em and I were saying maybe we're like using the word useful or practical actually in a wrong way, because Emma brought up the point, like, what could be more practical or more useful than being more fully human, right? Than being a wiser person. Think about Shakespeare and the rich depth of humanity, of his characters, and how we are changed as we read and study those words. So it's kind of interesting. I feel like we need to maybe define some of these terms because they just get thrown around. But maybe
Mm-hmm.
we misunderstand what is useful and what is actually practical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when people are claiming you'll never use this in real life, you'll never use this in real life, it's like, wait, what's real life?
Yes.
Well,
Yeah,
what's
maybe
real life? And then we go into philosophy. So how can you say we're not using this?
exactly. Like, what is a good life, right? All of a sudden we get
Mhm.
really deep really fast. Which, then that shows that we also share that like nerdy homeschool side, which is one of the reasons why I love you. So tell me a little bit more about why you decided to have a nerdy homeschool YouTube channel and what you kind of hope to communicate there.
So I know that homeschooling itself can be a lonely road, and being passionate about homeschooling can be lonely because in real life, you might not have anyone that you can like geek out over curriculum and schedules and lesson plans, and teaching philosophy with. So my goal on YouTube is really to be that nerdy homeschool friend who is always going to be excited about planning and implementing homeschool. So someone that everyone else can feel gets their excitement. And I always say that my comments, my email inbox are open for anyone who just wants a listening ear as they're planning and they're implementing and they're troubleshooting in their homeschool. I love calling my fellow homeschool moms further up and further in, challenging us all, myself included, to be gradually more skilled at this great big job that we have taken on, and just simply sharing the joy of nerdy homeschooling. And I know that nerdy homeschoolers who actually like academia for its own sake can also feel a little bit like outsiders, even in the homeschool world. So I do always want folks to come along and feel, hey, I'm not alone. So that's why I bring nerdy homeschool conversations to the internet.
And I think it's so encouraging too, how you always do really encourage us as homeschool moms to take our job seriously, to take this as a calling seriously, and to seek to become more skilled and more faithful in it, just like we would any other calling or
Mm-hmm.
vocation. It's not just something we can just sort of wake up in the morning and do thoughtlessly, right? We ought to take it seriously. And I think that's a really important encouragement. Well, I have enjoyed getting this chance to chat with you again. Here at the end, I'm going to ask you the questions that I ask all my guests. And so the first is, what are you personally reading lately?
Well, I'm always kind of cycling through a few books. My most homeschool mom classic one I'm reading right now is A Waking Wonder by Sally Clarkson. Never read that one before. More than halfway through it now and chewing on the ideas there. And I'm also But a lot of what I read these days is really read aloud to my children. So I'm also reading The Very, Very Far North, and I highly recommend it. This one is hilarious to me. I love the characterization. Great. So
I'll have
it's
to add
fun
that
to be
one
at
to
this
my
stage.
my library hold list.
I love getting to the stage where my kids are old enough that the books I'm reading to them are a little bit more complex, a little more entertaining, which is really fun.
Yes. Well, the final question I have for you is, what would be your best tip for turning around a homeschool day that seems to be going all wrong? I'm sure you've never had any of those.
Well, I would say pause. Pause to communicate and redirect attention to what matters. Hey, what's going on here? Because the meltdown is probably not about math, ultimately. Um, Redirect to what's the purpose of what we're doing here. Usually taking just a few minutes to pause, to hug, and to redirect our hearts toward the purpose of these daily learning times that can be effective. A few minutes to figure out what is going on without getting totally sidetracked, because sometimes children will also use that opportunity. But sometimes just a quick pause and quick, hey, we're not trying to solve all the issues in the world and all the issues in life right now, but we are just trying to faithfully do the next little thing. And we, pause to calm, pause to connect. It's not much use pushing through the lesson when your child needs more of a heart lesson in the moment. So pausing to address the heart and even address the fact that our emotions and our desires are not even always truthful. They aren't always right. And we can bring truth and purpose back into the situation, calm down, and then return back to work, ideally.
Yeah. And sometimes even just taking that pause to pray. Sometimes I forget that and there's an issue going on. I'm like, all right, well, let's stop and let's address this. And I just jump right in to try to fixing or solving the situation. My husband is much better than I am about consistently. First thing he does is like, let's stop and pray. And then we move on to discussion. So I'm trying to continue to grow in that. But sometimes we forget that pause. Like, if you're having a hard time, like take a moment and pray. Go to the throne of grace together, right? Mommy needs
Yeah.
Jesus. You guys need Jesus. We all need Jesus together. And starting there before we try to fix the pain point on our own.
Absolutely.
Well, Rachel, where can people find you all around the internet?
So I am on 7 and All on YouTube, and I share nerdy homeschool videos every week. It's also 7 and All Family on Instagram, where I do share little snapshots of our own homeschool life and various thoughtful written posts on homeschooling and homeschool culture. And then I publish homeschool printables and curriculum at where'dyoulearnthat.com. And yep, that's where you can find me.
And I will have all of those links in the show notes for this episode at humilityanddoxology.com. I would encourage you to take a minute and share this episode with another homeschool mom, maybe someone who needs that encouragement for faithful consistency, or someone who would enjoy a little bit of nerdy homeschool life. So, Rachel, it is always a delight to chat with you, and I'm glad you came back on. I know that several people actually I had asked, like, who do you guys want to see back on the podcast? And multiple people were like, Rachel from 7 and All. So they've been excited. I'm like, oh, I got you. I got you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. This was fun. And we didn't even stay up too late past my bedtime. So
There you go. Goodbye, Rachel. Thanks again.